So now, excellent. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So as you can see, the title is a little bit different. It's not about credit, but rather about were female firstborns killed in Makkah Bechorot. And first, I'm just going to do this. Okay. And initially, upon seeing this topic, I think many of you and personally I wouldn't even think that it would be a discussion, where I've always assumed that Makkah Bechorot only applied to the men and not to the women. And this is for specific reasons, because looking at the text, that's what it appears to be. So if we look and start directly in source 1 in Shemos, so this is when God first comes to Moshe and he's telling him his mission to get Bnei Israel out of Egypt. And when he tells him, he says that Paro's not going to listen to you. Basically, Hashem does a lot of foreshadowing and spoiler alerts of Moshe, whatever you do, Paro is not going to listen. He's going to harden his heart. And in the end, Hashem said he will, when Paro doesn't listen, it's going to end with the Makkos, etc. But the way Hashem phrases it is the first Makkah and the only one mentioned before any of the other ones happen is that the eldest of is Makkos Bechorot. So the idea that the eldest or firstborn will be killed. And we see this in source number 1. So Pasach Bet, this is Hashem talking to Moshe. Via Martel Paro, Ko Amar Hashem, B'ni B'chori Yisrael. So Hashem is talking about my eldest son, B'nai Yisrael, B'ni B'chori. Vayomer Elecha Shalach Es B'ni V'Yavdeni V'Tam'ein L'Shlacho, that send my son to serve me, and if you refuse to send him, Hine Anochi Horig is Bincha B'choracha. Then I, in turn, mida k'neged mida, tit for tat, will kill your firstborn son. But it explicitly says in the text that it's a son. And looking through the actual Makkah of Makkos Bechoros, it appears to be this way too, where the people mentioned as being impacted by Makkos Bechoros is Paro. We see Vayihi b'chatzi halayla v'Hashem hika kol b'chor ha'aretz Mitzrayim. And again, Bechor is in the male form of the word, where in Hebrew, you can sometimes have a word like Bechora, but specifically Bechor seems to be used. That Hashem, in the middle of the night, comes and he hits or kills all of the eldest in Eretz Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt. And then Paro, Hayeshev al Kiso ad Bechor Hashvi, Asher Rebeis Habor, Bechol Bechor Behema. And this specification of which eldest are killed are the eldest son of Paro, and the eldest son of even the lowly captive in jail. But again, it's all in male form. And as we continue, we see that for this Makkah, the reason it's so bad, or one of the reasons people say it's so bad, is because the system in Egypt, and I learned a very big word here, is a primogeniture system, where it's patriarchal, that the eldest son is an essential part of the economy and the essential part of the entire society of Egypt. It cannot run without its eldest sons. So it makes sense that this Makkah that is supposed to, demolish the Egyptians to the point where all 9 that came beforehand look like cake, would be the one that completely attacks and demolishes their entire system of running of society. And we see that after this, that Paro sends Bnei Israel out. This is enough. Everyone is crying. In Mitzrayim, Batitza Kagdollah in Mitzrayim. What's nice about being on a computer is you could highlight with your mouse that there was this great cry out in Egypt, and that there was no house where there was no death. And we see that in response, again, showing that this is probably only the male firstborns that were killed in Makkos Bechoros, is right after, this is the chapter after Makkos Bechoros occurs. Hashem says, Kadesh li kol bechor peter korechem b'bnei Yisrael bi'adam u'behema lihu. Hashem says that you are going to give me, essentially, or mikadesh, or sanctify towards me, all of your eldest in Israel and bnei Israel, and also all of your animals. But we see that it's not just the eldest, but it specifies the next pasuk only the male eldest. V'havarta kol peter rechem la'Hashem v'chol peter sheger behema asher yelecha has zecharim la'Hashem. That again, it's this idea that it's only the males, it's the male of the firstborn animals, and thus you could infer that it's also the male of the firstborn people from Bnei Israel. And when we go later on, when we see that the Bechorim, who we say initially the eldest sons, were supposed to be the ones who work in the Mishkan. But then after the sin of the golden calf, the Leviim are, because they were not a part of the sin of the golden calf, they are going to take over the jobs that the eldest would have had. And we see in that change, it only mentions that there were male eldest that were being exchanged for Leviim. So we see in source number 4, this is in Bamidbar, L'kachta mem pasuk memal for verse 41, this one. L'kachta es Leviim li ani Hashem tachas kol b'chor b'bnei Yisrael. So we're seeing that the Leviim are given the job that the Bechorim used to hold, the eldest used to hold. And we see in pasuk mem gimel, he kol b'chor zachar, that all the eldest that were holding these positions are men. And that if we see in Rashi, the reason that the eldest were chosen for to be the one that sanctifies Hashem's name is in direct reaction to Makas Bechoros, that because Hashem killed out all the eldest of Egypt and specifically did not kill out the eldest men of Bnei Israel, thus they are now almost owned by Hashem, Kilu, and thus we have to sanctify them. And from here we get the whole idea of Pidyon Haben, where we have, after a child is born, specifically the eldest boy, not the eldest girl, it only applies to the eldest boy with some different aspects to that, but essentially oldest boy, that they have to be redeemed. And we see this in the Pshat, where it talks about the how this works, but also we see it brought down the halacha, that nowadays we have Pidyon Haben. If the eldest is a son, then 30 days after the child is born, you give, I think it's 5 silver coins to a Kohen, and thus you buy back your child. And this idea stems from Malchus Bechoros, according to Shulchan Aruch. And so just to reiterate, what we're seeing so far is from the Pshat text, it appears pretty explicit that Malchus Bechoros applies only to male firstborns, because Bechor is a male term and it calls Bnei Yisrael B'ni Bechori Yisrael, and in response, the Mitzrim that we're killing are Bincha Bechorecha, so it seems your eldest son. So in one hand it's that, and also the fact that it applies to Paro, his eldest son. And then later we see within the kind of consequences to Malka Bechorot is that it is not every eldest men and women who are involved in Pidyon Haben, only the male eldest. Only the male eldest are given as the ones who we are told are sanctified to God. And it seems, according to Rashi and according to many Mefarshim, that this is in direct response to Malka Bechorot. Almost like another Midah K'neged Midah of I saved you from sparing you from not including you within the Egyptian eldest who were killed, the eldest males, and thus you eldest males of Bnei Israel will then be sanctified towards me and work for me. And because they messed up, now we give money to the Kohen in a Pidyon Haben format, because the Leviim took over the position of the Bechorot, and so now that is kind of the way it's trickled down through generations. And all this seems like it makes a lot of sense until you go back to the text for a second. And there was a phrase that I mentioned that, as you could probably tell from the color scheme, it's blue and pink, and that is intentional. Where although I quickly scanned over this before, but if only the eldest sons were impacted by Malka Bechorot, meaning that only they were killed, then how could it be, if we look in Pasuk Lamed in this pink bolded, Ki ein bayis asher ein shames. How could it be that there was not a house that in every single house there was a dead person or someone who died? Knowing from personally, although in my family the oldest is a boy, I have 2 sister-in-laws who the oldest are girls, and it's not everyone has the oldest who's a boy in every house. It's probably like 50-50.
Or sons at all.
Or sons at all, exactly. If you're I mean, they're not Jewish, but thinking about Pride and Prejudice, if you're one of the Bennets, like you're you get off scot-free. What does this mean? How could it be that it happens in every house if it's only men? And we see that, surprisingly, you'd think the answer would be, okay, maybe the Makkah Bechor applied to women as well. But that's not the answer any of the Mefarshim seem to give. Where if we look first in Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, so this is a midrash, where it seems like the different Mefarshim we're going to look at bend over backwards to try to explain how it could be everyone without including half the population. And so we see in Mechilta Rabbi Yishmael what he explains, or Rabbi Nassan says, is that the eldest, it wasn't just the eldest who died that night, but in families where there wasn't an eldest son, the memorials or things that were put in the house for that eldest, you can imagine in old patriarchal systems, you have all these memorials to fathers and great-grandfathers beforehand. All of these memorials were destroyed and broken, and so brought up the death all over again. Or if we continue on in this, another idea brought is that the Mitzrim used to bury their dead in their own houses. And so what would happen was all the dogs would come into the house and they would find the dead Bechorot and they would take them and bring them up, and seeing this, you can imagine seeing dogs basically attacking and destroying the bodies of your old eldest sons would bring back the psychological feeling as though it was happening that night, that they were just dying all over again. And we see here that Ela kivan shaya habachor meis lechad mehen. So when a bechor would die, hayosin lo inokin b'mamida b'beito, that they would make a memorial and put it up in the house. But to alayla, and on that night, nishecheket v'nidechet v'nizeret, that they'd be destroyed and demolished. And then that day was so hard, it was as though they were reburying them all over again. And same thing with this aspect. I don't want to bold it again because too much blue. V'lo od shelo elisha yu hamitzrim kovrin b'toch batehen, that the Egyptians would bury within their house. V'yu hakilavim nichnasin derech hakuchin v'michat titin, and the dogs would come in. And and they would find these bechoros, these bodies. And again, that same idea. That is almost as if they were dying again. The ideas brought by Rashi seem a little bit more, seem pretty plausible, where what Rashi says first off is yesh bechor meis, anyone who had an eldest died, and ein shem bechor gadol beis karoi bechor. And in a house that you didn't have a literal eldest son, let's say the eldest was a girl, then the head of the house would be killed instead. And what this comes back to is that patriarchal system, or that primogeniture system, where the head of the house was almost exclusively the eldest son. And in a case where you didn't have an eldest son, in that case, you would have the head of the household, whoever that may be. And the second idea brought by Rashi, which these are brought down from the Midrash, is that the Mitzrim, the Egyptians, were constantly sleeping around, to the point that in one house you could have 5 eldest, because women would be sleeping with many different men, and so they would have different eldest of men within one family, and men would sleep with many women, so then they'd have different eldest through the women. And thus, in every single house, this promiscuity was so intense that every house there were people who were dying. We see mitzriot mizonot tachas balehen yildot merukim pnuyim vayalehem bechorot harbe, that these women would again be sleep around and have many eldest. Pamayim heim chamisha lisha achas, sometimes they would have 5 to 1 women. Kol echad bechor levit, and technically each one was the eldest of his father. And then we have Ibn Ezra, who takes a simpler approach, where he basically says Al Arabi de Barakatov, that maybe it's not in every single house, but in majority of houses, this is what happens. And you can imagine it's not extraordinarily hyperbolic, but there is a hyperbole involved. And on one hand, we have all these Mefarshim, and it's kind of a question of, the simple answer would be, well, maybe Malka Bechorot applied to the women. But none of these Mefarshim seem to turn to that. But we do see in Midrash Rabbah that the Chazal, other, again, rabbis, and when we think of Chazal, it's our Tanan and Amoraim, that they do look at this case of Max Bechoros and say that it applied to the women. And it comes from this exact idea, where if we look here, it starts with Ein Bayis Ein Sham Mace, this idea of there was not a house that someone did not die in. They say, V'yach kol b'chor Mitzrayim, Rashis onim b'oalecham, tipa rishona. And so that in every single house in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, the eldest was killed. Hanakevos habechoros af hein metos. So explicitly in Midrash, it says that the women, the eldest who were women, even they died. Chutz mi Batya bas Paro. Only Batya, who I guess I have a special connection to as someone named Basya, but only she was saved and not killed amongst the eldest two girls.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, totally.
About the prior thought where there were many eldest in a home because a woman had children with many men.
Yes.
What about the concept of Peter Rechem, which is the first of the womb, which is how we determine a Bechor, right? So it doesn't apply there if the woman had many children who were the eldest of her husband, but they're not technically Peter Rechem. So it's a different explanation of Bechor.
So that's a good point. For Rashi, his is specifically about Peter Rechem, which is why he only mentions women. But there are other places in Chazal that mention that even men who weren't Peter Rechem, even eldest who weren't Peter Rechem were included, which would just kind of maximize the damage. But thank you for pointing that out. And so this essentially, what we saw so far is we have, again, it seems clear that the eldest is our men, and many Mefarshim defend this. However, we see this phrase that Ein Bayis Asher Ein Sham Mace, which makes it seem as though it would make sense, the most sense, that would include women. And we see in Midrash Rabbah that women are included, which is kind of giving us this dichotomy of, well, if Midrash Rabbah is saying that women are included, why are the Mefarshim going out of their way to say the opposite? And in fact, we see kind of as a defense again that maybe Malkut Bechorot does apply to women, is we see in source 10 in the Seichel Tov, who I apologize for minimizing my tab and opening another, but I looked this up before, who is a Rabbi Menachem ben Shlomo, he from the 12th century. So he points out, which is, before I phrased it as though Bechor is only male. But a lot of times throughout Tanakh, we see that Bechor could refer to both male and female. So for example, Bnei Yisrael, it's not only the sons of Yisrael, but it's cumulative. So when it's cumulative, it's used in the masculine, even if it's also referring to male and female. And so that's what the Seichel Tov says. He's referring to a point in Bereshis where Leah is bowing down with her children to Esav, when Esav and Yaakov have that confrontation at the end of Parshas Vayishlach, and it says Vayishtachavu, which is the male form of bowing. And so he says Kol makom shehu kolel zacharim and akevos, every place that it includes women and men, yachid, in one term, nekate lashon zachar, it uses lashon of zachar. So while initially our proofs against, just to reiterate, to clarify, the proofs that the Bechor was only male is first off the fact that the male form is used, and second of all, the fact that it appears as though we see for Pidyon Haben that it only applies retroactively, the consequences of Max Bechoros only applies to Jewish men, not Jewish women. And so first, and we also saw that Midrash Mefarshim seemed to say that only the Bechorim, the men, were impacted. But yet, on the flip side, we see here that first off, we have a different Midrash in Shemos Rabbah that seems to imply that the women, or explicitly says that the women were involved in Malkut Bechorot. And we see that although Bechor is used, which is a male term, it's actually also used for including female and male, so that's not necessarily proof. And what's even more interesting is what we see for for the firstborns, nowadays, when the Erev Pesach, the firstborns, there is a minhag that they fast. So if you have an oldest brother in your family, or you'll see that they go to they have this commandment to fast because of Malka B'chor, this idea of your life is at stake, so you want to fast because of that. And so we have, instead of fasting, is we can do a meal of a mitzvah, or do if you hear what's it called, a siyum, then that could make it so that you don't have to fast, but they are obligated to fast otherwise. But what's fascinating is it's not just men who are included in this fast, it's also women. And we see this brought down the halacha, where in Shulchan Aruch, this is the Rabbi Yosef Karo. So he exclaims, that even the eldest women would fast. And the same person, again, Yosef Karo, but in a different halachic sefer, Beit Yosef, he says this even more explicitly. V'katav b'tshuva Ashkenazit, it's written for, I guess this is Ashkenazi minhag, d'nekeva shehi b'chora, that a woman who is the eldest, katav b'sefer aguda d'tzricha letanos v'riya mibatia bas paro. So again, going back to that midrash, because that midrash, that women were involved in Makot B'chorot, thus we have to fast, women have to fast if they are the eldest. And if we continue, we see that even when you have, the way it works is if you have an eldest who's a boy, normally until he's the age of 13, until he's bar mitzvah, his father fasts for him. But in a situation where the father himself is an eldest, then we see that the mother is actually obligated in fasting for him. And we see this in Darchei Moshe. So al chad she'eh bachor ubeno bachor, if you have a man who is the eldest and his son is the eldest, im yishtot tzarich litanot b'shvil haben, that does the wife or the mother have to fast in his stead? And we still see that she ein tzarech, although you don't have to. Aval haminhag she'av o ha'im mitanein b'shvil b'neihem aktanim. But it's minhag that the mother or the father fast in his stead. And again, we see in Aruch HaShulchan kind of these two views almost contradicting each other, where on one hand he says, V'yesh mi shomer she'af nekeva b'chora mitanit, this is source 14, that even the female eldest have to fast, sheharei vadai b'mitzrayim gam hein nehargu b'malchos b'choros, that vadai, explicitly, definitely in Egypt, they were killed as well in Malchut B'chorot. But although the Aruch HaShulchan seems to say they were specifically and definitely women who were killed as the eldest in Malchut B'chorot, he then says in the bolded blue, Umikol makom, and anyway, ein haminhag kain. This is not the minhag. Mitam de minikevos lo tziva kadosh baruch hu likdashan rak hazcharim. Because the commandment, again, of Pinyon Ben only applies to the men, not the women. And we continue to be left in this complicated situation of, is it that on one hand we see that men on one hand we see that women, according to this, potentially have to fast even, and that they are included in Malchut B'chorot. But what we saw before with Pinyon Ben, and something that the Aruch HaShulchan just brought up, is that women are specifically not obligated in it, to the point that for a Pinyon Ben, if the father is not there to sell the son, then the woman, the mother, actually is not obligated whatsoever to sell the son in his stead, or do the Pinyon Ben. Where we see, and this is brought down by the Rambam in source 1, that the woman is not obligated in Pinyon Ben of doing that for her son. And we see in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that ha'im eina chayavet lifdos es bana, and he explains the same idea, that a mother is not obligated to do the Pinyon Ben for her son. But even more so, if the father is not around, then it doesn't land on the mother to do it. Rather, it lands on the Beis Din, and if not the Beis Din, then on the son himself to do it. Really just taking women out of it completely. And so what we're kind of left with, again, is this question where, on one hand, if we say that women are involved, so on one hand, how can it be that women were included in Malchut B'chorot and they too were killed, and we fast because of that, or potentially that is a minhag, even though we no longer do this. And we fast as an acknowledgement that we were spared, and yet Pidyon Ben, or this idea of sanctifying the eldest sons, is also, how could that be a response to Makkah Bechorot of acknowledging that the men were spared, the Jewish men? So kind of just to reiterate or to clarify, that if Pidyon Ben exists because Hashem miraculously saved all the Jewish firstborns and he owns them, then the only plausible read of Makkah Bechorot would be that it's just the men, because only Pidyon Ben only applies to the men. So is there a way to reconcile the idea that you could have Makkah Bechorot apply to both men and women, but also have this other aspect that only the men are in consequence the ones held responsible or held to be sorry, I'm just gonna reiterate because I think it's an important point to get accurate, and it's a complicated way to say it. Basically, we have a contradiction here, where on one hand, we have people who are saying, we have Chazal and we have Halacha that makes it seem as though women were included in Makkah Bechorot. But going through Makkah Bechorot, what we saw is that the reaction to Makkah Bechorot is only the Jewish men are made to be sanctified to God, not Jewish women. So if Makkah Bechorot is a midah k'neged midah, a tit for tat of this happened to the men, and thus in response we are having Pidyon Ben, which only happens to the men, then it would seem that women shouldn't be included. But yet we see in Halacha and we see potentially in the Midrash that women are included. So the question is it in a all or nothing situation where it can only be that it's about the men and women couldn't have been killed, and thus the Midrash it's difficult to include? Or is it that there is a way to reconcile both to each other? And so the way, yes.
Is there any opinion that says that female children have to be redeemed in a pidyon, or it's only Pidyon haben?
It's only Pidyon haben.
So that's an interesting piece of this as well. Whether it's the mother or the father being obligated to do the pidyon has no reflection on the actual child being redeemed, which is only boys.
Yes, sorry, just thank you for bringing that up, because to clarify, that's kind of the issue here, where it's only about the son. It's not about daughter at all. And which is the question of if girls were involved in Makkah Bechorot, then it should be Pidyon Ben and Habas. And so, but then again, even if we say, okay, Pidyon Ben only applies to the men, we still have that issue of, you still have that in the back of your mind, you still have that Midrash Agada, you still have the halacha of potentially women are obligated in the fast of Bechorot. And so it's kind of a question of how do you reconcile these two things? And the way we potentially do so is, or which helps us in doing so, is the Sefer Chinuch. This is the Sefer Chinuch does not have a known author. It is anonymously printed. Not to get into the history of it, but it's very interesting of different people who kind of like a whole question of who wrote it and why. But the first thing he says about Pidyon Ben is maybe, which will help us, is that maybe Pidyon Ben isn't just about Makkah Bechorot. Maybe there's more to it. And we have this idea in Judaism about this idea of bikurim, which is that the first of everything we designate for God. So for example, if you're firstborn of an animal or your first fruits, that you don't eat them, but instead you designate them for Hashem. And so what the Sefer Chinuch says is the idea of Pidyon Ben actually stems from here. This is his initial reason for Pidyon Ben. Mishar Shei HaMitzvah Zo, that this is the root of the mitzvah. Sheratza Hashem Yisbarach Lizakosenu Lasos Mitzvah Bereshis Perio, that Hashem wants to do this mitzvah of again the first of your fruits. The mandaskia kol shalo ve'ein lo ladam debar beolam rak ma shechalek lanu Hashem Yisbarach b'chasidav. So this idea that the reason we're giving the first of our fruits, or we will see the first of our sons, is to show that everything is God's. And although we feel really proud of the fact that this is our first son, and especially for a Bechor, because that it's a male, because in the system, patriarchal system, which we've had pretty much up until the 19th century, 20th century, this male is it's the major fruit. He is your offspring. He is what will continue your line, and who is he's the economic person who will continue all your land and property. He's going to own it and pass it on. So it makes sense that you're very proud of him. You have to remember that really he comes from Hashem, and that is the point. It's going back to that idea. But yet we also see in Sefer Chinuch that he says, "V'od lezecher hanes hagadol," but also to remember the great miracle, "Shasal lanu Hashem yisbarach b'buchorei Mitzrayim," that Hashem has done for the elders of Mitzrayim, "Shehargam etzilam mi'adam." And so again, although initially Sefer Chinuch is bringing the idea, this should be in blue, I apologize, that the Sefer Chinuch is bringing the idea that Pidyon Ben comes from this idea of Bikurim, again, of just bringing the firstborn to remember that this is from God and we want to thank Hashem. He's also saying that it's in response to Malchus Bechoros. But now we're seeing two separate ideas, where before we identified and defined the eldest as only one thing. You're the eldest, and that's it. But what we see here are two different definitions of eldest, where you can have eldest that is a literal eldest, meaning the first child that is born, and you can have the symbolic eldest, which, going back to the idea of that economic aspect of your firstborn eldest, it's symbolic. It is the person who carries on your lineage. It is a person who owns all your property. And so going through back to the story of Malchus Bechoros, it could be that although the literal eldest died, meaning the men and women who were the eldest died, only the symbolic eldest, meaning only the men, are held accountable. Because when we're thinking of Bechor in terms of the symbolic meaning, again, looking at the Egyptian society, looking at our society for so long, the eldest son was one who continued on, he was the fruit of your labor. He was the one who continued on your lineage. And your property. And so on one hand, you could say that you have Bechor does not mean just men or just women. It can mean both. But the symbolic Bechor can only mean men. And we see this in the Midrash Tanchuma, that when it says Kadesh li kol Bechor, what Hashem is saying, again, this is about where the idea of Pidyon Ben stems from. So they ask that, what does it mean, Kadesh li kol Bechor? Klal Zacharim and Akevot, does it include men and women? Because the word Bechor includes both men and women. And they ask, Yachol kol shenoled rishon bein Zachar v'bein Akeva yeh Bechor? Could the eldest, who is a woman or a man, be considered a Bechor? And Talmud Lomar, their answer is, Kol ha-Bechor v'gomer ha-Zachar tikadesh, Zachar v'lo nakeva. And so again, what we're seeing in the Midrash Tanchuma is this idea that the actual idea of a Bechor, in the literal sense, just the word itself can imply either a female or a male. But once we're talking about Mekadesh, of sanctifying, then it just becomes this symbolic, or the concept, the structure of a Bechor. And lastly, kind of just to hit this idea home, is Rashi, where, again, talking about this pasuk, this is the pasuk we started with, where called Bnei Yisrael Bnei Bechori Yisrael, that Hashem calls Bnei Yisrael his eldest. And the question we asked is Bnei Bechori, my eldest son Yisrael, and then Haragas bin Chabaracha, that in response for Paro holding Hashem's eldest son, Bnei Yisrael, that Hashem will kill his eldest son, we said maybe this is proof that it's about men and not women. But what Rashi points out is, again, this dichotomy, that it could be about both. That Bnei Bechori is Lashon Gedola, that on one hand, it's just emphasizing that they are the eldest, not having to do anything with gender. However, in the Midrash, Kan Chasana Kadosh Baruch Hu al Mechiras Bechora Shelkach Yaakov Me'esav. But what Rashi brings in a Midrash, that by saying that he is the Bnei Bechori Yisrael, it's not just saying that they are the eldest in the most simple term, but that they are the one that are inheriting Hashem's mission. That when Yaakov bought the Bechora from Esav, that stood, and that Bnei Yisrael are not just literally the eldest amongst the nations, but that we are the eldest in terms of this acquisition. And so kind of to answer our question of, are women involved in Mako Bechorot? Were they killed as well or not? We could say that, and how we can reconcile that with the fact that the consequence has nothing to do with women, Pidyon Ben, it's only men. We see that we're dealing with two separate things. We're dealing with the literal deaths and the symbolic response. And so for any of you who are the eldest girls, or have, there you go, Panina, or you have are eating Seder with people who are the eldest, who are girls, then you could tell them that when you get to Mako Bechorot, that, you know, they should take out a few more drops of wine from their glass cup, maybe, because they too could have been included in the Makkah. But instead, we're so happy and thankful that they were instead included in the nace of not being killed with Mitzrayim.
It's so interesting. I never heard that.
Yeah.
About women being included.
Right? I thought it was so interesting. I heard it. Here, I'm just gonna pause the recording.